Welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com. This video is part of our Star Sampler series. In the last video, you learned how to figure out cutting sizes for any size Lone Star. In this video, you'll get some tips for choosing fabric. Then you'll see how to cut and set up strips for an 18-inch Lone Star. Don't worry if you missed the first video. Below you'll find links to that and all the handouts mentioned in this series. As I stated earlier, this block is part of the Star Sampler series. Each block being demonstrated is made with red, white, and blue traditional fabric. So I'll mainly be using these to talk about fabric choices. But you don't have to limit your choices to these. Lone Star blocks look great in almost all color combinations. You might want to Google Lone Star to check out different combos for inspiration. You'll be putting a lot of work into this block, so you want to make sure that the diamonds in your Lone Star stand out. Usually, folks want to pick out the fabric for their diamonds first, but I actually think it's easier to find the background fabric and then pick out the diamonds. So here's some things to think about when choosing that background fabric. Your star points tend to get lost on these larger print fabrics if they're used in the background. So I would say to avoid larger prints or prints with a lot of color in them. It shows up pretty good on this background, but this print is directional. From the background fabric, you'll be cutting squares and rearranging them like this. And sometimes this can prove to be a distraction. Stripes are definitely distractions. But these prints, you might not notice so much. And the smaller the print, the less you'll notice. But it'll still be there. So you might want to stay away from these altogether. Look for what I call tone-on-tone fabrics that have small, non-directional prints. When I cut these up and place them side by side, you won't notice so much. When I put this on this fabric, there's a little problem here. This background blends into these red diamonds, so you want to avoid backgrounds that resemble fabrics in your diamonds. None of the diamonds get lost in this background fabric, and the same is true there. So either one of these backgrounds would work with these red and blue fabrics. Before choosing fabrics for your star, you'll want to decide what design you want in the star's rays. I like the fabrics to sort of radiate out from the center like this, but there's lots of different ways to color in this star. Another popular design is this one, where the centers lead out to the star points. You can download a blank one of these by following the links below. Once you settle on a design, count how many fabrics you'll need. So in this star, I'll need 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want to make this a different color, so 5. I'll need 5 fabrics. When choosing fabrics for the diamonds, you'll also want to stay away from these larger prints. When I cut these up into these smaller pieces, you see that you'll lose some of the colors that are part of this overall design, depending on where you cut. These diamonds are small in size, so fabric with smaller prints will work best. You should also try to avoid these directional prints, as it'll be almost impossible to get everything lined up properly. And depending on the way you cut, you might end up with stripes going in this direction or this direction. Of course, there's exceptions to every rule, so I think I'm going to try this directional print here, just to see how it turns out. I also think I'll try this large print here. Now, there's only 2 colors in this print, and I think when it gets cut up into smaller pieces, you won't notice the print so much. It'll just add a little bit of texture to those star rays. I used 5 different fabrics for my stars. If I decide that this is going to be my background, I want to see that each one of these fabrics show up against that background. And you can see even this lighter fabric shows up against that background. So I think these are the 5 fabrics that I'll use. Now I need to decide the order I want to place these fabrics. So I don't think I want the reds next to each other. So let me start with this, and maybe I'll put a red, a white, and a blue. Oh, let's see. Maybe I'll put this red, this blue, this white, this red, and then this blue. Once I decide on the 5 fabrics for the diamonds and the background fabric, I like to color in one of these stars just to make sure that I like that arrangement. If at this point you're still not sure of what fabric to use for your diamonds, you might want to cut some strips and then cut off some diamonds to play around with. They don't have to be perfect. You just need a few of them. Get some ideas where these fabrics will work best. If you cut 3 diamonds out of each fabric, you'll be able to arrange things around. So let's see, here's one arrangement. You see, I'm using plaid here, and I might like that, I might not. That looks okay, but I don't know if I want this in the center there. So let's switch this out. I think I want these with that blue. We'll put this blue in the center, the red like that. Now I'm not sure about the way this plaid is lining up. So each time I make an arrangement, I take a picture. Then I'll compare the pictures to decide which one I like best. Here's another thing you might want to try when choosing fabrics. If you have 2 mirrors, you can place them on the corner here. You can kind of see what this repeat looks like. Now the longer the mirror, the more of this pattern you'll see. Unfortunately, I can't find my larger mirrors, but I thought I'd share this with you anyway. In the last video, you learned how to calculate the cutting sizes for a Lone Star block using this handout. Now I've simplified that on this sheet. Here's a Lone Star with Y seams, and here's one without seams, and this is what we're going to be working on today. On this handout, you'll find the yardage requirements for an 18-inch Lone Star without Y seams. As always, you want to make sure to press your fabric before cutting. From the background fabric, you'll need to cut 4 of these corner squares at 6 1/4 inches, and then you'll cut each on the diagonal. For B, you'll need to cut 4 squares at 4 3/4 inches, and then cut those on the diagonal. I usually cut each diagonal individually, but you can stack each one of the squares and then cut. Try using a vertical line on your board to help double check to make sure they're lined up. Then use that line as a guide for your ruler when cutting. Now to cut these 72 diamonds, we'll be using this handout. In the last video, I showed you how to label these smaller diamonds to make it easier to set up these strip sets that you'll use to make this larger diamond. So I've colored in my Lone Star based on these 5 fabrics that I'll be using. This first fabric I'll call C1, so I'll label that. The second fabric, which goes here, I'll call C2, so I'll label that. This third fabric goes here, that'll be C3. This is C4, and this is C5. If you want to make this design, you'll have to relabel these small diamonds. And then, based on your fabric in these strips, you'll have to relabel these strip sets. Now, some folks like to put the numbers on each one of their fabrics to make it easier, but that's not necessary. From C1 fabric, I need 1 strip. From C2, I'll need 2 of these strips. From C3, I'll need 3 of these strips. From C4, I'll need 2 of those strips, and from C5, I need 1 of those strips. Each strip measures 1 3/4 inches by 44-45 inches. If you bought fat quarters for this project, instead of using regular yardage, you'll need to cut a few more strips in each color family. Use this handout to lay out your strips. Notice that these strips don't meet at the top. They're staggered. When you sew them together, you'll want to drop down about 1 inch or so to add the next strip. Make sure that C1 ends up at the top. Then lay out your next group of strips. It starts with C2, and then C3, and then C4. And the last set of strips start with C3, and then C4, and then C5. Take each section over to your sewing machine and then stitch with 1/4 inch seams. After sewing, press the seams in the direction of the arrows, or you can press the seams open. Next, you'll want to cut these sections from your strip sets. Now these are cut on 45-degree angles, and they are 1 3/4 inches wide. So I'm going to take my ruler and find that 45-degree line here. If you don't have a 45-degree line on your ruler, you can find it on your board, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But first I'll show you on the ruler. So I'm going to take that 45-degree line and line it up with the top of my piece here. And let's see, let's scoot this over a little bit. So I've got that lined up with the top of this strip. And let's see, I think I can scoot it over a little bit more. Part of the reason why we sewed them together at this angle is so you don't waste a lot of fabric on the end here. But there's also another reason. You want to make sure that you're cutting the strips in this direction as opposed to in this direction. So when everything's lined up, I'll cut. I use this ruler to get that 45-degree angle. Now I'm going to use this ruler to measure over 1 3/4 inches. So 1 3/4 inches is right here along that line. So I'll place that line on the edge there. I got to move around my table here to cut. So there's my first section, and I'll need to cut 8 of these. After cutting a few of these, you might want to double check against your pattern here. So I've added a 1/4 inch seam right here. Just going to put that right in the middle there. And I can see it looks good on this side and it looks good on this side, but down at the bottom here, I'm off just a little. And up at the top, I'm off just a little. So if it's less than a 1/16 of an inch, which is a 1/4 of one of these little squares here, then I say it's probably okay and it's good to go. If you're off by more than that, you might want to go back and check either you're cutting, you're sewing, or you're pressing. And I find often when I'm doing these diamonds, it's my pressing that I'm off a little on. You can also cut these strips using that 45-degree angle on your board. Bottom of the strip on one of the horizontal lines, and then find that 45-degree angle. And let's see, here's that 45-degree angle, and you can see that I've got to move this over a little bit. So let's go like this. I line this strip up on the horizontal line, and here's my 45-degree line here. I'm going to line my ruler up on that line, and then I'll cut. And there's my 45-degree angle on the edge here. Then I just come over 1 3/4 inches, line that up there, and then cut. When cutting these, I have a tendency to veer off to one side or the other, or all of these are bias edges, so sometimes those edges get stretched when cutting. So I like to cut 1 or 2 of these strips, put them aside, and then go back to checking that 45-degree angle. And here's the 45-degree angle on this ruler. So I'm going to put that alongside that cut, and let's see. I can see that I've veered off to the side here by this ruler. It starts going in this direction, and it's not up against the fabric. So make sure that I've got that 45-degree angle. I'll come back over here. I line up my strip on that bottom mark, and then I'll trim that angle. I've got everything lined up. I'll trim. It was just a little off, but each time you cut, you get a little more and more off. So I like to check, as I said, about every 2 cuts. Then I'll come back to cutting like this. And there's a number of ways you can check. You might be able to use your ruler every time to check. When you're cutting, you always want to make sure that you're at that 45-degree angle. If your ruler has this 45-degree line, you'll want to line that up with one of the edges. Line up that 1 3/4 mark and cut. So instead of just lining up an 1 3/4 and cutting, you want to double check here to make sure that that 45-degree angle is correct and that this is lined up at the 1 3/4 mark. So I need 8 of these out of each strip set. If using fat quarters or scraps of fabric, you might end up with something that looks like this on your strip set. I've only cut 6 of the 8 that I need, so no problem. I just cut another strip of the number 1 fabric. I'll just sew it to this and continue cutting. In the next video, you'll learn how to sew a Lone Star block without any Y seams. Hope you stay tuned. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please like, subscribe, and share our videos with your friends. Remember, if you're trying to find us on the internet, type in LearnHowToQuilt.com. Don't forget the .com. Using the .com will get you right to our site.